Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad right now to be joined by Carla Joy Bergman, who's a mom and storyteller, and she dabbles with writing and media making, often opening realms of autonomy, reciprocity, art, creativity, and challenging empire. Carla aims to keep the embers burning with and for the youth and the coming generations. You can find all of her work over at joyfulcarla.com. Carla, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me. Such a delight to share this space with you again, Eleanor.
For folks listening, Carla has authored many things, from pamphlets to books, but today we're kind of going to be focusing on Trust Kids. And I want to start off, first of all, because I love the title, because it made me immediately think of the tango scene from Moulin Rouge, where the Argentinian says, "Without trust, there is no love." And while parents will unequivocally oftentimes say that they love their children, many would also openly admit that they don't trust them, in which case, ... And I want to start with the culture that we have of raising kids. A lot of the focus is on the kids, like what they need to do and how they need to act this way and say this. But the trust kids aspect is really about us as adults and parents and how we need to reframe, well, our framing. And as one parent wrote in a recent post I saw, kids are the mirrors to the unhealed parts of ourselves. Could you talk a little bit about that reframing of the focus on kids need to do this as opposed to like, hey, maybe adults need to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And big fan of Moulin Rouge. Oh my God. I just want to say I just love that you brought that together. Thank you. Because I agree. I think when I think about, I write a lot about joy, and people often, think that is the thread that runs through my work, but really it's trust. If you look back at everything, it's trust. I think it is the foundation of any kind of good community or collective or household or any environment where people are together in relationship. Trust is like a baseline. Trust is like the necessary foundation for anything to, for love to take root, really. So I love that connection. I've never been interested in writing a parenting handbook or speaking to parents, because it's too wrought. It's too emotional. People get too defensive immediately. I also don't think it's helpful. So I'm more interested in zooming out and looking at the systemic issue that's actually that's causing the problem, and that is adult supremacy as a system of oppression. And it felt important to me. I've been in this conversation and in this work for over 20 years, and really my whole life, because it begins with me and dealing with my own oppression that happened to me as a kid. And there's been, we can look at all the pockets of beautiful change that's happened over the years because of child advocates and people pushing against this, from John Holt to bell hooks. But at the same time, when you start looking at the stats, it's really actually not that much better. And, for example, all the states, including Canada, you can still spank your kid at home. It's still legal. And in the US, it's like, I think 19 states where corporal punishment in the schools is still okay. And kids grow up to become adults and they replicate it because they weren't trusted as a kid. And you can just see the circle. You can just see the dynamic. And I wanted to get the conversation out of two places, out of it being locked and siloed in child and youth liberation through schooling, and then parenting. So I wanted to bust open and really zoom out and look at, all adults are invited into this conversation with love. And let's look at how adult supremacy is in every single room, in every place, all the time. So, and how it causes so much harm. And that's why I, did kind of a polemic title. Trust kids, a kind of a demand.
Yeah, well, I love it. It definitely reads as a call to action, and I love that. And I want to shift also to the kids that are present in the book, not least of all Liam Joy Bergman, your kid, who wrote about needing guidance. And when I read that, I was like, oh gosh, this is a point that I have to address, because that can feel really unclear and prickly to a lot of adults and parents. A bit like when we talk about how humans need to be with nature. We got to let nature be who it is, but also engage with it, not just like extract ourselves and be like, oh, just we have to let go of nature. Like, no, we are nature. Could you talk about being an adult and parenting in this way that some might find contradictory, like the honoring autonomy while at the same time giving guidance?
This happens in all relationships, in all spaces. Me and a co-author for Drug Milsey, we named it This Tendency, Rigid Radicalism, and it definitely comes into radical parenting. And the thing is that this comes up to a larger issue for me around care and around tending to relationships. I mean, when you look up the meaning of the word freedom, at the root of it, it just basically means dear beloved. So when you're working in a relationship with someone about their freedom and about autonomy, like, where's love? And meeting people where they're at in care and needs. And just to be upfront, I have chronic illnesses and other issues that require a care flowing in other ways in our house. So this isn't just a top-down situation about support and guidance. And like, who doesn't need guidance, right? Is like the other thing. There's a fantastic quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, of course, about how, we need guides because otherwise people they're going to map out your life for you. And guides will sometimes help intervene. And actually, the role to me of good guidance is listening at the root of it. So the sort of the other side of the coin, or maybe it's even part of the whole composition of trust, is like, first of all, believing people when whatever their perception is, and then listening. So I think that it's a good place to really practice what having a loving, autonomous, flowing relationship is like with anybody, but particularly where power is palpable. Like, you actually do have power. And I feel on the daily with it because I get overwhelmed. I have too much work. I'm trying to write and the needs are coming at me too much. And I just, the short fuse thing happens and I leverage power. And then it's all in the recovery. It's all in the acknowledging and the relationship and making sure you're tending to that trust, that foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that so much of what I hear from folks that I feel like are farther in this journey of this kind of radical parenting say, oh no, I still mess up and I still do this wrong. And I'm like, okay, phew. Which, I mean, one should know inherently, because it's just like being anti-racist or anti-oppression. There is no like goalpost where you reach it and you're like, got it. So of course we're always growing and learning, but it is helpful to hear. And I think that with that, I kind of want to get into something that you shared with me when I was still pregnant, which I asked you for some elevator pitch advice, and you were like, just trust your instincts and trust your kid. And I think something that I've learned since having a kid is that kids can be very scary in the sense that they force you to question the system, but also in my case, like my anti-capitalist, anti-oppression ideals. Like, that's even scary for me, who, if you would have asked me like 2 years ago, I'd have been like, of course I'm all of those things. And this is a really powerful way for me that I've looked at adult supremacy. And also in the book, there's a lot of discussion about how this is a decolonizing effect as well. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how questioning adult supremacy, how really like being forced to question those ideals that you've been programmed with, is really a matter of decolonizing ourselves as well.
Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. One of my main mentors who passed away while I was writing the book, Gustavo Esteva, him and Madhu, they did research like primarily in Mexico and in India about this kind of idea about kids, like, where are the kids? They had a chapter called Where Are the Kids? And what they found was that in villages and small communities where colonial ideals of family and how kids should be, this whole construction of the child, which actually happened with European colonialism. Overall, in most communities, by the time the child was 5, they were like considered a major part of the community. Like, so they were participating in the ways that they could. And again, this is another way where you have to take off the lenses of like those kind of biases and those lenses of ageism, because and we live in such an ableist society too, because there's so many adults who can't participate at some levels due to different disabilities or predilections, or so it's the same with kids. And so kids would participate fully, and the piece that comes with trust that's really important is responsibility. So like how to have responsibility for each other and for the place, and kids are invited into that by about age 5, and this is what they found. And that's a very decolonial model. It's a very like denuclear family model. And all that stuff was constructed under early colonialism, including schooling. You can just trace it. And so anything that you do that undoes those social borders that are really massive is going to be a decolonial act, because at the center of it is colonialist white supremacist ideals, and includes patriarchy as well, and ableism. I mean, all of them. That's why I like to just say empire.
Indeed. It's a catch-all. And I want to get into the questions about the nuclear family as well, but another thing in the book that I liked was that it also talked about, this extends to the way that we organize, we parents and adults who do organize. Are we organizing in a space and in a way that invites kids in? Or that, I think one of the quotes in the book was like, is it a 12-hour meeting with no breaks and people just keep talking? Like, most adults can't pay attention to that. Like, why would we expect kids? And then that means that we're excluding the kids from that space. But then we never get their insights and their input, which perpetuates this kind of supremacist model.
And yeah, indeed, that was Leanne Simpson. That was such a fantastic quote. Yeah. Like, I'm always clearly very interested in intergenerational and multi-generational ways of coming together, because to me, it's like we have to, like, it's actually going to save us if we have to drop these social borders. And I'm not just talking about age, all of them. I'm not talking about boundaries. I'm talking about borders, the ways that we are cut off from each other and excluded from each other. It's not the same as othering. Othering is something that is going to happen no matter what utopia we end up, or joytopia or thrivetopia. Othering is always, differences is always going to be there, but borderings will hopefully be gone.
I like that you made that distinction between boundaries and borders, because again, boundaries are something that it's important to have with kids, with adults, with everybody. Yet borders are what cut us off. So I appreciate you making that distinction. And I want to turn now to one of the primary things that gets discussed when we talk about trusting kids, and when we talk to stepping into this radical space against adult supremacy, is the concept or the issue of school. And with good reason, like, kids spend a lot of time in school. And even when they're not in school, like, I remember in high school, I had like 3 hours of homework every night. So I was in school long after I left the physical space. And it's a bit like economist Richard Wolff puts it: we expect democracy in a government, but not in our workplace where we spend most of our lives. Like, that's silly. And here we would claim to be anti-oppression, and yet we send our kids to institutions that oppress and forcefully mold them into good little proles. Can you talk a little bit about, I mean, it's ridiculous to ask you a short question about this, but could you talk a little bit about unschooling and deschooling and how that is a vital aspect of trusting kids?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a massive topic. And I did, out of the sort of, I think there's 4 sections in the book, there's only one that really dives into it, although it threads through the whole book, because I didn't want to, like I said, this is often gets siloed here for really good reasons. And this comes back to that idea of intersectionality of like different ways people are oppressed. So as long as we have capitalism and colonialism and all these other isms that destroy our lives, like, school is going to be an issue. So I've always been interested in pushing against the binary of school and not school, and actually trying to nuance it and think about it in a deep and profound ways. At least that's been my aim. And we used to call it odd schooling. And this is one of the things I help a lot of young people do: how to leverage the systems around and create your own education, especially when you get after sort of age 13, 14, like, just the ways you can sort of hack the system to make it work for you. Because there's all kinds of things that people think there's only one route. but you don't have to, it's not a linear thing that, oh, okay, I guess because of our financial situation or our lifestyle or our work, we're just going to have to like send our kid to school forever for 12 years. But that's just not true. Like we always had a relationship centered home, not a child home. So the conversation of schooling, all that stuff was always a conversation we had together because everybody was included in what that would look like, with a basis of that you get to own your education, you get to own your learning, you get to follow your curiosity. And I'm here as a facilitator to help weave together and work and find those mentors and find those institutions or alternative spaces for you to plug into it. That's my role as an adult who has those access and can do that work. So, while overall we unschooled, we also were lucky to be part of a democratic free school that was publicly funded, which is really rare. So my kids got to do that's why we called it odd schooling, because they had access to teachers, they had access to a community and multi-generational spaces of learning, but they also both dropped out really young and I think one of the things you see with kids who have a lot of autonomy and a lot of freedom in their day-to-day life is by the time they're 12, 13, 14, they're pretty ready for engaging with like adults, quote unquote, kind of in spaces, environments, learning spaces, whether it's college level or whatever. And the other piece I think that's really vital for people to understand is there's this reflex. Anytime people create alternatives to the kind of model of prefiguration, like we're the bad guys, right? Like people always go after them. So this happens with alternative schools. Well, they cost money, so they're bad. But when you actually step away from that a little bit and look at the whole spectrum of schooling that's happening, and let's just use the US because that's where you are, there's way more charter schools that are in the privileged realm that are really expensive for elite families, elite kids to quote unquote become like the myth of meritocracy. Like if they just work hard, everything will be great. And then the other piece is like the privilege. One of the things people used to say, it's really privileged that you unschool your kids. And here we are, working class family living in a moldy apartment. Like, no, this was like, it's because it's actually, I care about it like too much. Right. So so we're the bad guys, apparently, people who want to create intergenerational communities of learning where kids can follow their predilections and their proclivities and their desires and their curiosity, where they can study physics at age 8 because they have a aptitude for that, or start reading at age 12 and not have any stigma on that because they're busy like organizing community potlucks. And at the very core, schooling is a system that was created that goes along with capitalism and colonialism so deeply. It was constructed that way, and it's so trusted and believed. And even Marx, the big famous quote with debate between Marx and Bakunin, Marx thought school was good, and Bakunin was like, but that's where they're getting indoctrinated with like, this is where it's happening. And Marx's like, no, it's fine, better than working, and it's like, well, no, you're wrong. But I realize the time here, but this goes way back. Schooling resistance began at the moment the rise of schools happened. So even Tolstoy had alternative schools in Russia because he believed in freedom of learning. Emma Goldman, like it just, it goes way back, Kropotkin. So there's so much material out there around unschooling, deschooling, and alternatives to schooling for kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's my fault for asking such a ridiculously broad question.
It's a great question.
So at the core of a lot of what we've been discussing is the concept of power. And you talked about leveraging power in that kind of adult supremacist space and have, the power that we have over children inherently in this system. And to me, one of the harshest manifestations that I see or have been a part of is shaming, shaming kids to be in line with the values of a fundamentally crooked and cruel system. And I was wondering if you could mention, like, how is that shame at odds with the concepts of trust and love?
Really it's about pushing against the dominator model, right? The domination model. And that was Bell Hook's big thing. And she was one of the feminist Black writers who centered children as the site of where the work needed to begin, because we're raising future patriarchs and future oppressors. And I think like shame is is something we all have. So there's trust, but then there's believing people's perspective, right? And kids they're constantly belittled, constantly. It comes back to that idea of like guidance. Like there's a place for going, yes, and right. Yes, yes, I believe your experience. And let's have a conversation about the system outside of you. That's happening too. This is, I think, where people trip up, and how one of the things why I went the route I went with this work away from kind of the alternative schooling to alternative to schooling was the entrenchment of individualism that can happen in spaces where kids are being centered, and why I had that nuance of a relationship-centered home. Because if we're really trying to undo these social borders, then we have to really show up. Like this isn't about me going, yeah, I'm just going to center all your needs and I'm going to put my whole stuff over here. But I think, like, just back to your very first question, it's back to that idea of an invitation into adults to work at being a trusting adult. And that a couple of people wrote about that in the book as well. We only can work with ourselves and where we're at. And we're all pretty hurt around the way we were shamed and the shame we carry. And it turns into being called other names like imposter syndrome, or when you give yourself like negative self-talk. So we're carrying that into our relationships with kids, and really it's about ourselves, the ways we've abandoned ourselves, and then we just replicate it, and it's devastating. And we can see like the rise of kid suicide is massive. It's never been higher, and kids are really not doing well, and that's because we have an adult supremacist system, and we need to look at it and confront it and work together and support each other in undoing those borders.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of wrapping up here, I want to, again, like a very broad thing that is impossible to shrink down to this kind of conversation, but here we go. One of the things that I loved is that it showed up a couple of different ways in a couple of different phrases. Solidarity begins at home, or anarchy begins at home. And of course, anarchy is a word that particularly in the US is like, and I've tried to deal with that. But I love that both of those phrases showed up in the same book, because to me, they are synonyms in many ways. And there was a David Graeber quote that was shared in the book that I love. Quote, "We are all communists with our closest friends and feudal lords when dealing with small children," end quote. And that's so true. And when I read Solidarity Begins at Home, it creates that, kind of looping back to what you just discussed at the beginning, like we have to look at ourselves and we have to think about how are we showing up as, either anarchists, or how are we showing up in solidarity. And so I'm wondering if you could just say in little ways, what are some ways that you first started, or that one could start unpacking what that really means, like solidarity beginning at home with yourself?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, that was the original title of the book. And it was because that was my social media thing I did for about a decade to push back against the siloing of youth liberation being only a school issue. I chose solidarity. I've had some debates with some poli-sci people about not using liberation or justice. And I did it intentionally because it's about right now. It's not about a future. Justice, liberation, that's what we're all working towards. And they sort of go together. But solidarity can happen immediately in the way that you can hold the nuance of difficult situations. And one of my examples that I like to use, because I have consent to talk about it, is being in solidarity with two kids who are 10 years apart in age, and being in solidarity with both of them in a way that they both feel heard and held, but also being called in to have solidarity for each other. And that was sort of where it was in practice the most, but also, with the other adult in the house. And we had that kind of solidarity flowing where he worked a lot, and their dad, and my partner, Chris, he worked a lot and he was maxed out. He also does a lot of the domestic stuff because he's good at it. And I have health stuff, and he would be maxed out sometimes, and he would, that fuse I talked about earlier would go off. And we had it. It was very open that my youngest could come and say, I'm having a difficult time with Chris, and not throw him under the bus, but also have my kids like complete safety in place, emotional safety or whatever, and just like talk to them both about what's happening in the dynamic. What do they both need? So there's just, it's really concrete to me. You know, Kropotkin, like he flipped between mutual aid and solid. They were the same word to him. And I agree. And so mutual aid, like when you branch it out of material needs, you know, and think about care and love, like it is about solidarity. It is about like my love, my self-love, my self-care, my needs are also part of this composition of relationships, and how we can all find thriving in the home. And it's, you know, I feel like that was probably a little abstract, but
It was kind of an abstract question. There's so many people who, I mean, and I've even been in radical spaces, like, and people would be always welcome to bring their kids because so many people had kids.
Yeah.
And I saw a mom hit her kid. I saw like, and we are so radical in our anti-oppression politics, except for the most vulnerable people in our society. Like, what?
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking. You know, I always have this thing where you could, if some of the statements that come out, like comparing Trump to kids, or there's just a whole slew of ways that kids get violently brought up in conversation. And if you just replace kid with any other marginalized group, you see the problem instantly.
Totally.
You see the problem instantly. And I invite people in to do that exercise. When you are having an impulse to call somebody childish or children-like or whatever, just replace it with another marginalized group. And maybe don't do it publicly, because you'll be canceled because you'll immediately see
Right.
like,
How
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Right. How violent this is. And luckily a lot of those little kids aren't online singing. Like, I always think about the kid at home being like, wow, my parents must not like me. Like they compare me all the time to this person they hate.
Right.
Like, what's happening? And also, I have no power. I'm the opposite
Right.
of Trump.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Like,
Totally.
you know, but it's an impulse. It's not impulse. It's a reflexive way of, you know, it's just part of the vernacular. We've all been trained not to use ableist slurs anymore. We all did forever. It's part of that work, and it's definitely one of the things I like to put out in the world.
Yeah, which you do so brilliantly. So yeah, I mean, this conversation could go on for days, but
Wrap up.
is there anything that you'd like to add that maybe I didn't touch on, or anything that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, I think just two things. Reiterate that this is an invitation to all adults, anybody who has fallen into the trap of adulthood and the power that comes with it. You are invited in to confront your supremacy. And then the second piece, because it's something that gets brought up a lot, is that ageism is at both ends. So and I want to demystify that a little bit. So the elders, yes, they lose some of their power, but they have rights. They have rights that kids don't have. And they have a lot of rights. And so that has to stop being conflated. It's a very different situation. It's an important area of conflict and struggle that needs to be addressed, but they have rights. Kids do not. And kids don't even have physical rights in a lot of cases. So there's so much work to do. And this is just a loving, caring invitation into let's work on helping kids have better, thriving lives now, not in some utopian future.